Ilara Preston Hughes believed her husband Liam was a failure. It was not a belief born of malice, but of a deeply ingrained certainty, a fact as solid and unassailable as the marble floors of her ancestral home. He was a quiet man, a mid-level financial analyst whose greatest ambition seemed to be achieving a perfectly balanced spreadsheet. He was kind, yes, gentle, certainly, but in the world of the Prestons, a world built on aggressive acquisitions, dynastic wealth, and the brutal calculus of social standing, kindness was a liability, and gentleness was indistinguishable from weakness. They didn't know that Liam's quiet was not emptiness, but containment. They didn't know his spreadsheets were not for a regional firm, but for tracking the tectonic shifts of his own hidden empire. They didn't know their son-in-law, the man they pitied and patronized, was Silas, the anonymous, almost mythical creator of the Ethel blockchain, a man whose net worth was a staggering, liquid $89 billion. And so, on a bright Tuesday afternoon, while Liam was on what she assumed was a sad, little business trip to a regional conference in Ohio, Ilara performed an act of what she considered both charity and domestic cleansing. She donated his old computers to the Preston Family Foundation's annual tech drive for underprivileged schools. 3 desktop towers and 2 older laptops. They were dusty, bulky things cluttering up his small home office, a room she'd long planned to convert into a yoga studio. She felt a pang of satisfaction as the charity's collection team hauled them away. It was a perfect, twofold victory. A tax-deductible act of public generosity and a step toward forcing Liam to modernize, to perhaps buy a sleek, respectable laptop like her brother Marcus. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly comprehend, was that she had just given away the cold storage hardware wallets containing the cryptographic keys to a fortune that could buy and sell her family's entire legacy 100 times over. Within 72 hours, that simple, condescending act of charity would detonate the foundations of her life, her family, and everything she held to be true. We hope you're settling in for this one. It's a story about the quiet ones, the underestimated, and the moment the world finally sees them for who they are. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love to see how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy seeing arrogance meet its match, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of satisfying justice. Now, let's get back to the calm before the storm. The call came as Liam was reviewing quarterly projections for a shell corporation he used to manage philanthropic investments. The caller ID read, Ilara. He smiled, a genuine, warm expression that softened the intense focus in his gray eyes. He imagined she was calling to check in, perhaps to complain playfully about her mother or a caterer for an upcoming event. Hi, love, he answered, his voice calm and even. Liam, darling, she began, her tone bright and artificially brisk. It was the voice she used when she'd made a decision without him and was presenting it as a delightful fait accompli. I hope Cleveland isn't too dreary. I did the most wonderful thing today. You know the tech drive for the foundation? Well, I finally got around to clearing out your office. All that old junk is gone. It's all going to a much better home, to children who need it. Liam's smile didn't falter, but a stillness settled over him. It was the stillness of a grandmaster seeing a catastrophic blunder on the chessboard. Old junk? Ilara, what exactly did you get rid of? Oh, you know, those big, ugly black boxes and the old laptops you never use. The ones with all the stickers on them. Honestly, it's a breath of fresh air in there. Now you have a reason to get a proper computer. She laughed, a light tinkling sound that grated on his nerves for the first time in their 5 years of marriage. He closed his eyes. The stickers. A faded logo for a long-defunct coding collective. A stylized wolf, the insignia of his first major project. Each one a breadcrumb from a life she knew nothing about. Inside one of those ugly black boxes was a lead-lined Faraday cage. And inside that cage was a series of hardware wallets, disconnected from any network, holding the private keys to the Genesis block of the Ethel chain and its subsequent earnings. $89 billion. He had diversified, of course. He had other assets, other access points, but the core, the dragon's hoard, was in those machines. Ilara, he said, and the word was heavier now, freighted with a significance she could not detect. Where are they? With the Foundation's collection team, I told you, they're being processed at the warehouse downtown. They'll be wiped and distributed to the schools next week. Richard is even going to make a speech about it at the gala on Saturday. It's a wonderful PR opportunity for the family. Richard, his father-in-law, the patriarch of the Preston dynasty, a man who moved through the world with the unshakable confidence of someone who had never been told no. Richard, who treated Liam with a kind of weary, paternal disappointment, as if he were a charity case Ilara had insisted on bringing home. The irony was a physical weight in Liam's chest. The Preston Family Foundation, a vanity project designed to launder the family's predatory business reputation into philanthropic gold, was about to process his life's work as scrap. "I need you to do something for me, Ilara. It is critically important," Liam said, his voice dropping into a lower register, a tone of command he had never used with her. "You need to call your father. You need to tell him to halt the processing of that specific donation. Tell him to isolate those machines and lock them in a secure room. Nothing is to be plugged in. Nothing is to be turned on. Do you understand?" There was a pause. He could hear her silent recalibration. She was not used to being given direct, non-negotiable orders, especially not from him. "Liam, don't be so dramatic. What could possibly be on them? Old tax returns? It's for charity. Honestly, it's a bit selfish to make a fuss. This is important for my family." My family. She had said it so easily. After 5 years, he was still an adjunct, a satellite orbiting the massive gravitational pull of the Prestons. "It is more important that you listen to me right now," Liam said, the steel in his voice now unmistakable. "Do it, Ilara. Call him now. I will be home tomorrow." He hung up before she could argue further. He stood and walked to the vast window of his suite, which did not overlook the dreary streets of Cleveland, but the glittering, sun-drenched expanse of the Singapore harbor. The regional conference was a lie he had told to avoid another weekend of enduring the Prestons' casual cruelty. He was here to finalize a multi-billion-dollar deal to fund desalination plants across Southeast Asia, a project he was financing anonymously. He looked at his reflection in the glass. The man looking back was not the meek, slightly stooped analyst the Prestons saw. He was tall, with the lean, powerful build of a man who practiced discipline in all things. His eyes, which he usually kept carefully neutral, now held a chilling clarity. For 5 years he had played a part. He had done it for love. He had fallen for Ilara's fire, her beauty, her laughter, believing that the woman he loved existed somewhere beneath the suffocating lacquer of her upbringing. He had been patient, waiting for her to see him, the man, not the placeholder in the column marked husband on her life's ledger. He believed that love could bridge the chasm between his world and hers. Now he saw the flaw in his strategy. He had wanted to be loved for who he was, not what he had. But by hiding what he had allowed them to define who he was. He had given them the power to deem him unworthy. Her casual, thoughtless act was not just a mistake, it was the ultimate expression of her disrespect. She hadn't just given away his computers, she had given away his history, his identity, his life's work, because she had deemed it, and by extension him, to be worthless. He took a slow, deep breath. The game had changed. The quiet man was about to leave the stage. Silas was about to make his entrance. He pulled out his phone, not the simple one Ilara knew, but a sleek, encrypted satellite phone. He dialed a number from memory. "Aries," he said when the call was answered. "Change of plans. Liquidate 10% of the Phoenix Fund. I want it in fiat by morning. And book me a flight to Westchester. The real work is about to begin. The drive from the airport to the Preston estate was a journey through the architecture of his humiliation. He passed the gaudy country club where Elara's brother, Marcus, had loudly joked about paying for their dinner because Liam's credit card might get a little sweaty. He passed the boutique where Elara's mother, Eleanor, had once looked at his off-the-rack suit and sighed, "Oh, darling, we'll have to get you properly tailored before the benefit. Appearances are everything." And finally, he turned onto the long, winding drive of the estate itself, a sprawling testament to 3 generations of ruthless commerce. Its manicured lawns and towering oaks, a silent judgment on his own modest background. He pulled his sensible 4-year-old sedan to a stop behind Elara's gleaming new Maserati. The contrast was not lost on him. It was a carefully curated tableau, a visual metaphor for their entire relationship in her family's eyes. He saw her waiting for him on the grand stone steps, her arms crossed, a portrait of impatient beauty. "There you are," she said as he got out. There was no hug, no welcome kiss. Her face was a mask of irritation. "I have had the most dreadful morning. Do you know how embarrassing it was to call my father and tell him to halt a charity donation because you might have some old photos on a hard drive?" Liam said nothing, merely taking his single, understated travel bag from the trunk. He walked past her, up the steps, and into the cavernous marble foyer. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of lemon polish and old money. "Did you hear me, Liam? Daddy is furious. He said it makes the foundation look incompetent." "Did he do it?" Liam asked, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. He placed his bag down with deliberate care. "Yes, he did it," she snapped. "The machines are locked in the security office at the downtown headquarters. Now, will you please tell me what this is all about? What could possibly be so important on those dusty relics?" From the library, Richard Preston emerged, a heavy crystal tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. He was a bull of a man, with a thick neck and a florid complexion that spoke of rich food and richer whiskey. He wore his authority like a bespoke suit. "Liam," he boomed, his voice oozing a condescending bonhomie. "Glad you're back. Your wife has been in quite a state. Had my entire logistics team in a scramble. I hope you have a damn good explanation for this." Liam turned to face his father-in-law. He met the man's gaze directly, without the subtle deference he usually employed to keep the peace. "The explanation, Richard, is that the contents of those computers are my private property, and I did not authorize their removal." Richard chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Private property? Son, they're 20-year-old pieces of plastic. We were doing you a favor, doing the community a favor. Don't get your feathers ruffled over a bit of spring cleaning." At that moment, Marcus sauntered in, spinning a golf ball in his hand. He had the same arrogant set to his jaw as his father, but with a crueler, sharper edge. "What's all this? Liam finally lose it over his ancient video games?" He grinned at Liam. "Don't worry, buddy. I'll spot you a few $100 for a new one. You can even pay me back, eventually." The 3 of them stood there, Richard, Marcus, and Elara, a united front of casual disdain. They were the judges, the jury, and the executioners of his worth. And the verdict had been in for years. He was found wanting. Liam felt a strange calm settle over him. The anger he'd felt on the phone from Singapore had cooled into something harder, more precise. It was the clarity of a man who had nothing left to lose because he had finally realized he'd never had what he thought. The love he had sought was an illusion, the acceptance a mirage. "It's not about video games, Marcus," Liam said, his voice level. He looked from Marcus to Richard and finally to his wife. "Elara, you and I need to go to the Preston Tower. Now. We are going to retrieve my property." Elara's jaw dropped. "Absolutely not. I am not marching down there and further embarrassing myself and my family. Whatever it is, it can wait. You are being completely unreasonable." "Unreasonable?" Liam repeated the word, tasting it. He let out a short, soft sound that was not quite a laugh. "You're right. I have been unreasonable. For years." He took a step closer to her, and for the first time she seemed to register the change in him, the absence of placation in his eyes. "I have been unreasonably patient, unreasonably tolerant, unreasonably quiet. That is about to change. We can go together, or I will go alone. But I will be leaving with my property in the next hour." Richard stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on Liam's shoulder. It was meant to be a gesture of paternal dominance, a physical reminder of who was in charge. "Now listen here, son. I don't know what's gotten into you, but you are in my house, speaking to my daughter. You will lower your tone, you will show some respect, and you will drop this nonsense. The computers stay where they are until after the gala. It's good for our brand." Liam looked down at the hand on his shoulder, then back up at Richard's face. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and removed the hand, his grip surprisingly firm. He held Richard's gaze, and the jovial mask on the older man's face began to slip, replaced by a flicker of surprise, then anger. "Respect, Richard, is earned. It is not a function of your net worth or the name on your building," Liam said, his voice still quiet but now laced with something that bordered on a threat. "And as for your brand, you have no idea the damage you are about to do to it." He turned and walked back to the foyer, picking up his bag. "I am going downtown. The offer to come with me, Ilara, is still open, but it expires in 5 minutes. He walked out the door without looking back, leaving the three of them standing in stunned silence in the echoing marble hall. For 5 years he had been a ghost in their lives, a polite, smiling phantom they could ignore and dismiss. But the ghost had just spoken, and his voice was that of a stranger they were beginning to realize they did not know at all. Ilara, her heart hammering with a confusing mix of indignation and a nascent, unfamiliar fear, watched his car pull away. For the first time, she had the terrifying sensation that he wasn't the one being left behind. She was. The Preston Tower was a monument to corporate vanity, a shard of smoked glass and steel that tore at the skyline. Liam had always found it oppressive, a physical manifestation of Richard Preston's ego. Today, however, he walked into the lobby not as an intimidated son-in-law, but as a man on a mission. The security guards, accustomed to seeing him as Mr. Preston's quiet tag-along, barely gave him a glance as he approached the front desk. "I'm here to see Martin Henderson in building security," Liam said to the receptionist, whose face was a carefully constructed mask of professional boredom. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, not looking up from her screen. "No," Liam said. "Tell him it's regarding the assets secured for Richard Preston yesterday. The code is 7 Alpha Tango." The receptionist's fingers paused over her keyboard. That was a priority code, one reserved for the Preston family and the highest level executives. Her eyes flickered up at Liam, a hint of confusion in them. She had cross-referenced him in the system a dozen times. He was Liam Hughes, husband of Ilara Preston. No special access, no priority clearance, yet he had the code. She picked up her phone, her professional indifference giving way to cautious deference. A few minutes later, a harried-looking man in a rumpled suit emerged from a set of elevators. This was Martin Henderson, the head of corporate security, a man whose pension was tied directly to Richard Preston's good humor. "Mr. Hughes," Henderson said, his tone wary, "Mr. Preston called and said you might be coming. He also said, and I quote, 'not to give you a damn thing until he gets here.'" "That's fine," Liam said calmly. "I'm happy to wait, but I'll be waiting in the secure holding room with my property." Henderson's face tightened. "I can't do that, sir. My instructions are clear. The items are locked down. Access is restricted." Liam held the man's gaze. Martin, your primary directive is the protection of Preston assets, correct? Your secondary directive is the mitigation of any and all threats to the corporation. Is that an accurate summary? Henderson blinked. Well, yes, in broad strokes. What would you say is the single greatest threat to a publicly traded company like Preston Industries? Liam asked, his tone becoming Socratic, patient. I don't know, a market crash? Industrial espionage? Reputational damage, Liam stated, as if it were a law of physics. The kind of damage that happens when a company is found to be in possession of stolen, high-value proprietary data. The kind of data that, if it were to be mishandled or accidentally wiped in your facility, could trigger lawsuits that would make a market crash look like a rounding error. Are we following each other so far? Henderson's ruddy complexion paled slightly. He was a security man, not a lawyer, but he understood the concept of liability. Are you saying what's on those computers is? I'm saying that my property is currently in your possession, Liam cut in smoothly, and I am here to ensure its integrity. If you prevent me from doing that, and something happens to it, the liability chain will start with your name. Richard's instructions will not protect you from that. They will only prove you were following an unlawful order. The logic was cold, brutal, and inescapable. Henderson was caught between the immediate wrath of his boss and the hypothetical, but far more terrifying, wrath of a squadron of corporate lawyers. He looked at the quiet, unassuming man in front of him, and for the first time saw not a pitiable son-in-law, but a man who spoke the language of risk and consequence with terrifying fluency. He made his choice. This way, Mr. Hughes, he said, his voice now strained. He led Liam toward the secure elevators, his back ramrod straight. The secure holding room was a small, windowless cube, bathed in the sterile hum of climate control systems. On a metal table in the center of the room sat the familiar dusty towers and laptops. Liam felt a wave of relief so profound it was almost dizzying. They were untouched. He ran a hand over the cool metal casing of the main tower, his fingers tracing the outline of a faded sticker. It was all there. He turned to Henderson. Thank you, Martin. I will wait here. Henderson nodded, looking immensely relieved to be relinquishing responsibility, and backed out of the room, sealing the heavy door behind him. Liam was alone with the digital keys to his kingdom. He didn't try to access them. He didn't need to. The first rule of cold storage was to keep it cold. He simply sat in the uncomfortable metal chair and waited. He didn't have to wait long. 20 minutes later, the door hissed open to reveal Richard, Marcus, and Alara. Their expressions were a symphony of outrage. Richard's face was thunderous. Marcus's was a smirk of disbelief. And Alara's was a portrait of pure, unadulterated fury. What in God's name do you think you're doing? Richard bellowed, his voice bouncing off the soundproofed walls. Threatening my staff? Throwing your weight around in my building? Who the hell do you think you are? I'm the man whose property you stole, Liam replied, not rising from his chair. Stole? Marcus scoffed, stepping forward. It was junk, you idiot. Alara was doing you a favor. We were doing you a favor. This is what we get for trying to help you? For trying to make you seem a little less pathetic? Liam's gaze flickered to Alara. She stood slightly behind her father and brother, her arms crossed, her chin high. She said nothing. Her silence was her endorsement. In her eyes, he was not her husband being attacked. He was a problem her family was handling. This is your last chance, Liam, Richard said, pointing a thick finger at him. You will walk out of this room, leave the computers, and we will all pretend this embarrassing little tantrum never happened. You will apologize to my daughter, and you will show up at the gala on Saturday with a smile on your face. We can put this behind us. It was an imperial decree, a statement of terms from a king to a court jester who had forgotten his place. Liam finally stood up. He was taller than Richard, a fact that always seemed to surprise the older man. He looked at the three of them, a family unit welded together by arrogance and entitlement. He had tried to become a part of that unit, to earn his place through love and patience. He saw now that the only way they would have ever accepted him was if he had been born a Preston. "No," Liam said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the small room with the force of a physical blow. "No," Richard repeated, incredulous. "No, I will not leave my property. No, I will not be attending your gala. And no, we will not be putting this behind us," Liam said, his voice gaining strength with each word. He looked directly at Alara. "This isn't behind us. This is just the beginning." He then did something they did not expect. He walked over to the main computer tower. From his pocket, he produced a small, simple-looking USB stick. It was the one object he always carried, the emergency key. He inserted it into a port on the front of the machine. The computer remained off. It wasn't a data transfer he was initiating. It was a fail-safe, a dead man's switch, now armed. "What are you doing?" Alara asked, a genuine tremor of fear in her voice now. The quiet, predictable man she thought she knew was gone, replaced by this cold, calculating stranger. "Securing my assets," Liam said. He removed the key. "These computers will now be moved to a secure third-party vault of my choosing. My lawyers will be in contact to arrange the transfer. You will not interfere." Marcus laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Your lawyers? What lawyers? The public defender you've got on retainer?" Liam ignored him. He turned to leave. Richard blocked his path. "You're not going anywhere. Security!" The door opened and Henderson stood there with two uniformed guards, his face a mask of misery. Liam didn't even look at them. He kept his eyes on Richard. "Call them off, Richard. Trust me. It's the single best piece of financial advice you will ever receive, and I'm giving it to you for free." There was a moment of pure standoff. The air crackled with tension. Alara, for the first time, felt the terrifying possibility that they had made a mistake. A profound, catastrophic mistake. This wasn't about old photos. This wasn't a tantrum. This was something else, something bigger. "Dad," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Just let him go." Richard, hearing the fear in his daughter's voice, hesitated. He looked at Liam's unnervingly calm face. The man standing before him was not the person he thought he knew. Doubt, an unfamiliar and unwelcome sensation, began to creep in. With a grunt of frustration, he stepped aside. Liam walked out of the room without another word. As he passed Alara, their eyes met. In hers, he saw a maelstrom of confusion, anger, and a dawning horror. In his, she saw nothing, just a cold, quiet emptiness where his love for her used to be. The door hissed shut, leaving the Prestons alone with the sudden, chilling realization that they were no longer in control. The 2 days leading up to the Preston Family Foundation Gala were the quietest, most tense days of Alara's life. Liam did not come home. He did not call. He did not text. He had, for all intents and purposes, vanished. The only sign of his activity was an email from a prestigious and notoriously aggressive law firm based in New York, formally notifying Preston Industries of their representation of Mr. Liam Hughes and arranging for the secure transfer of his personal effects. Richard had been forced to comply, his fury simmering beneath a veneer of corporate necessity. The computers were gone, moved by armed guards to an undisclosed location. The family's narrative, however, quickly solidified. Liam had had some sort of breakdown, a midlife crisis, Marcus called it, sneering. He was unstable, Richard declared, a classic case of a man punching above his weight and cracking under the pressure. Alara found herself clinging to this explanation. It was easier than confronting the icy certainty in Liam's eyes, the terrifying competence with which he had dismantled her father's authority. She told herself he was being petulant, that he would come to his senses in return, tail between his legs, begging for forgiveness. Yet a seed of doubt had been planted. She found herself wandering into his small office, now stark and empty. She ran her hand along the bare desk where the computers had sat. For 5 years he had seen that room as a symbol of his lack of ambition. Now she felt a creeping dread. What had she overlooked? What had she been so blind to? She remembered moments, Liam on his phone late at night, speaking in what sounded like code, a package he'd once received from a Swiss courier that he dismissed as work stuff. His uncanny ability to predict market shifts, which he always passed off as lucky guesses. They were puzzle pieces she had never bothered to assemble. On the evening of the gala, the Preston estate was ablaze with light and activity. Valets in crisp uniforms parked a river of luxury cars. Women in jewels and designer gowns floated up the grand staircase, their laughter echoing in the night air. It was the pinnacle of the Prestons' social calendar, a night to see and be seen, a performance of power and philanthropy. Ilara, dressed in a stunning, backless crimson gown, moved through the crowd on autopilot. She smiled, she air-kissed, she accepted compliments on the foundation's good work. But her heart was not in it. Every time the grand doors opened, she found herself looking, a knot of dread and a flicker of something she dared not name as hope tightening in her stomach. Her father took the stage just after 10 o'clock. A massive screen behind him displayed the foundation's logo. The crowd fell silent, champagne flutes poised. "Friends, colleagues, welcome," Richard began, his voice radiating warmth and authority. "Tonight we celebrate another year of giving back, a year of empowering our community." He spoke for 10 minutes, a well-rehearsed speech about corporate responsibility and the duty of the fortunate. Ilara stood near the front, her mother on one side, Marcus on the other. They looked proud, regal. "And this year," Richard continued, his voice swelling, "I want to give special thanks to my own daughter, Ilara, for her initiative in our Tech for Tomorrow drive." He gestured to her, and a polite wave of applause rippled through the room. Ilara forced a smile. Ilara understands that progress means letting go of the old to make way for the new. In a gesture of this spirit, she even donated her husband's old, obsolete computer equipment to the cause. A few people chuckled. It was a gentle barb, a classic Richard Preston move, a public display of dominance disguised as a family anecdote. Marcus smirked. Ilara felt a hot flush of shame. It was one thing to mock Liam in private. It was another to do it here, in front of everyone. "While that particular donation was recalled for sentimental reasons," Richard said, with a dismissive wave of his hand, "it is the spirit of the gift that matters, the spirit of looking forward." It was at that exact moment that the grand doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as every head turned. Framed in the doorway stood Liam. He was not the Liam they knew. He was not wearing an ill-fitting suit or a nervous, placating smile. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored, dark charcoal suit that fit him like a second skin. His posture was straight, his shoulders broad. He looked not like a mid-level analyst, but like a titan of industry. The quiet, unassuming man was gone. In his place was a man who radiated an almost dangerous level of confidence and power. He was not alone. Flanking him were two figures. On his right was a severe-looking woman with a leather portfolio, clearly a lawyer. On his left was a man whose presence sent a second, more powerful shockwave through the room. Mr. Kenji Tanaka, the notoriously reclusive and legendary head of global tectonics, one of the largest and most influential investment firms in Asia. Tanaka was a kingmaker, a man who never attended social functions. For him to be here, in Westchester, at the Preston Gala, was unthinkable. And he was standing beside Liam Hughes like a trusted lieutenant. Liam's eyes scanned the room, ignoring the shocked faces, the whispered questions. He found Ilara, and his gaze locked onto hers. The cold emptiness was gone, replaced by something she couldn't decipher. Pity, perhaps, or finality. He began to walk forward. The crowd parted for him as if he were royalty, a sea of silk and tuxedos receding before his calm, deliberate stride. He, his lawyer, and the legendary Kenji Tanaka walked directly toward the stage, their footsteps the only sound in the suddenly silent ballroom. Richard Preston stood frozen on the stage, his speech forgotten, his mouth slightly agape. Marcus's smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of slack-jawed confusion. Eleanor Preston gripped her husband's arm, her knuckles white. Liam stopped at the foot of the stage. He looked up at his father-in-law, his expression unreadable. "Richard," Liam said, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the vast room. "I believe you were talking about the spirit of giving. I'm here to continue that discussion. May I?" He didn't wait for an answer. He walked up the small set of stairs and onto the stage, taking his place at the center of the spotlight. He turned not to the crowd, but to Richard, to Marcus, to his wife. He was no longer a guest in their world. He was an invading force. The quiet before the storm was over. The hurricane had just made landfall. Liam stood at the podium, the warmth of the spotlight a stark contrast to the icy atmosphere that had descended upon the ballroom. He adjusted the microphone, the small sound echoing in the profound silence. He looked out over the sea of faces, the titans of finance, the society doyens, the media moguls, all of them staring at him with a mixture of confusion and rapt attention. They were the jury for tonight's proceedings. "Good evening," Liam began, his voice steady and clear. "My father-in-law, Richard Preston, was just speaking about progress, about letting go of the old to make way for the new." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "It's a powerful idea, but it's predicated on one's ability to distinguish between what is obsolete and what is foundational." He turned his head slightly to look at Richard, who was still standing a few feet away, paralyzed with a mixture of fury and disbelief. For example, some might look at an old dusty computer and see junk, obsolete technology, something to be discarded and given away for a small tax receipt and a moment of public praise. A nervous titter went through the crowd. They could sense this was more than a family squabble. It was a public execution. Others, however, Liam continued, his voice dropping slightly, drawing the audience in, might know that the value is not in the casing, but in what it holds. Not in the appearance, but in the substance. Inside that obsolete junk was the cold storage ledger for the Genesis block of the Ethel blockchain. The name landed like a bomb. Ethel. It was the backbone of the new digital economy, a revolutionary technology that had reshaped global finance in less than a decade. Its founder was a mystery, a figure known only by the pseudonym Silas, a ghost who was rumored to be one of the wealthiest individuals on the planet. "The Ethel blockchain," Liam repeated, letting the implications sink in. "The very technology, I might add, upon which Preston Industries' entire fintech division was built, after you acquired a license through a third-party consortium in 2018. A license you paid a staggering $900 million for." Richard's face, already florid, had gone a ghastly shade of white. He looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. Liam's gaze swept past him to Marcus, whose face was a mask of dawning horror. "You once joked, Marcus, about spotting me a few $100s for a new computer. A generous offer. But as the primary key holder to a portfolio currently valued at $89 billion, I think I can manage." A collective audible gasp filled the room. 89 billion. The number was astronomical, nonsensical. It couldn't be true. This was Liam Hughes, the quiet, pathetic son-in-law. As if on cue, Mr. Kenji Tanaka, who had remained silent at the foot of the stage, stepped forward. All eyes turned to him. Tanaka was a man whose single word could move markets. "I can confirm," Tanaka said, his voice quiet but resonant, carrying an irrefutable weight of authority. I have had the distinct honor of knowing and working with Silas for nearly a decade. We have built worlds together. That man, he pointed a single elegant finger at Liam, is Silas. The confirmation was absolute. The final piece of the puzzle locked into place, and the picture it revealed was devastating. This wasn't a tantrum. This was a coup. Liam turned his attention back to the Prestons. He was no longer speaking to the crowd. He was speaking only to them. His voice was devoid of malice, holding only the cold, hard clarity of truth. For 5 years I have lived in your world. I have abided by your rules. I have accepted your judgment. You measured me by the car I drove, the suit I wore, the job you assumed I had. You found me lacking. You dismissed me. You pitied me. You held me in contempt. He took a step toward them. Richard and Marcus involuntarily took a step back. You, Richard, Liam said, his eyes locking on his father-in-law. You called me son, but treated me like a servant. You lectured me on the importance of brand, all while your brand was built on the foundations of my work. He then turned to Marcus. You, Marcus, you mocked my finances, my ambition, my very character. You saw kindness as weakness because in your world, cruelty is a currency. Finally, his gaze fell upon Alara. Her face was a ruin. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks, carving paths through her perfect makeup. Her crimson dress, once a symbol of her power and beauty, now seemed like a garish costume. She was trembling. And you, Alara, he said, and for the first time, a flicker of the deep hurt he had buried showed in his voice. I fell in love with a woman I thought was trapped beneath the weight of her family's expectations. I waited for her. I was patient. I was quiet. I wanted her to see me, just me, but you never looked. You never saw anything beyond the surface. You saw what your father and brother told you to see, a failure, an embarrassment, a project to be managed. He took a breath. When you gave away those computers, you weren't just giving away metal and plastic. You were giving away my trust. You were telling me in the clearest possible terms that I was worth nothing to you, that my life, my work, my history was junk. He stepped back to the podium. He looked out at the silent, stunned audience. The Preston Family Foundation speaks of empowering communities, a noble goal. So, in that spirit, I have a small announcement to make. He gestured to his lawyer, who handed him a folder. As of this morning, Liam announced, his voice ringing with authority, I have acquired a controlling 51% stake in Preston Industries. The world tilted on its axis. Richard swayed on his feet, grabbing the podium to steady himself. It wasn't possible. The stock wasn't for sale. It seems, Liam explained, a hint of ice in his tone, that a number of your institutional investors were more than happy to liquidate their positions when presented with a significant premium by a new fund established by Mr. Tanaka and myself. They, unlike you, understand the difference between a brand and its underlying value. He closed the folder. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. A special meeting of the board has been called for Monday morning. The first order of business will be a vote of no confidence in the current CEO and chairman. The second will be the launch of a full, independent audit into the company's finances, including the Preston Family Foundation. He looked directly at Richard. I'm sure you have nothing to hide. He then turned and walked off the stage. He did not look back at the wreckage he had created. He walked, flanked by his allies, back through the parted sea of guests, toward the open doors in the cool night air. The performance was over. The judgment had been rendered. The quiet man had reclaimed his kingdom, and in doing so had brought another crashing down into ruins. The immediate aftermath was chaos rendered in exquisite, slow motion. As Liam exited the ballroom, a dam of silence broke, and a flood of frantic whispers and panicked phone calls surged through the room. The gala, a meticulously crafted piece of social theater, had devolved into a scene of raw, primal disaster. The prey had not only escaped the hunt, it had turned and devoured the hunters in front of a captive audience. Richard Preston, his face the color of ash, finally collapsed into a chair behind the podium, his chest heaving. The authority that had defined his entire existence had been stripped from him in a matter of minutes, publicly and brutally. His mobile phone, which he'd left on the podium, began to vibrate incessantly. It was the call he'd been dreading for years, the one from the board members who had once been his staunchest allies, now calling to confirm their betrayal. He stared at it, unable to answer. Marcus, ever the predator, was the first to react with aggression. His face contorted in a mask of rage. He lunged for the stairs, intending to follow Liam. To do what? He didn't know. He just needed to inflict a physical reality on the nightmare that had just unfolded. But he was stopped by his mother, Eleanor, who grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Don't you dare," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. Her carefully maintained facade of serene matriarchy had cracked, revealing the hardened steel beneath. "You will not make this worse. You will stand here. You will hold your head up. We are Prestons." But the name, once a declaration of power, now sounded like a desperate plea. Ilara remained frozen, a statue of scarlet and sorrow. The world had been rewritten around her, and she was an illiterate in this new language of power. Liam, Silas, $89 billion, a controlling stake in her family's company. The facts were too large, too monstrous to fit into the framework of her reality. He wasn't the failure. She was. She had been living in a palace convinced it was a hovel. She had held the king's hand and pitied him for not being a courtier. Her gaze fell upon the faces in the crowd. The pity she had always felt for Liam was now being directed at her family. It was a thick, suffocating wave of it, mixed with scorn and a delicious, schadenfreude-fueled excitement. The Prestons, the unassailable titans, had been publicly castrated. She felt a desperate need to escape, to run, to hide. She turned and fled the ballroom, her high heels catching on the plush carpet, her crimson gown a blur of shame. She found herself in the manicured gardens, the cold night air a shock against her tear-streaked face. She sank onto a stone bench, the sound of the distant, chaotic party a dull roar in her ears. The lies she had built her life upon were not Liam's, but her own. She had lied to herself about her marriage, about her own happiness, about the very nature of worth. She had worshipped at the altar of status, and her God had just been revealed as a cheap, hollow idol. A few minutes later, her father and brother found her there. The fury had drained from Richard, leaving behind a terrifying emptiness. He looked old, defeated. "He's going to destroy us," Richard said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The audit, there are irregularities, things he will find." "We fight him," Marcus snarled, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "We get our own lawyers. We find dirt on him. There has to be dirt." "What dirt, Marcus?" Richard snapped, a spark of his old fire returning. "That he secretly built a multi-billion-dollar empire while we were mocking him for being poor? That he's a genius while we preened and postured? He played us. He played us for 5 years, and we were too arrogant, too stupid to see it." Ilara looked up at them, at her father and brother, the two men whose approval she had spent her life chasing. For the first time, she saw them not as giants, but as small, frightened men. Their power had been a costume, and Liam had just ripped it off. "This is my fault," she whispered, the words tasting like poison. Richard turned to her, his eyes cold. "Yes, it is. You brought him into this family. You couldn't control him. You embarrassed us all." The cruelty of his words was automatic, a reflex honed over a lifetime of blaming others for his own failings. But for the first time, they didn't wound Ilara. They clarified. She saw with perfect, devastating clarity that the flaw was not in Liam's deception, but in their own values. They had created the conditions for this disaster. Their pride had been the tinder, their arrogance the fuel, and her blindness the spark. "No," she said, standing up. Her voice was stronger now. "My fault was not in bringing him into this family. My fault was in ever thinking he was the one who needed to measure up to us." She turned away from them and walked back toward the house, leaving them in the cold darkness of the garden. She didn't know where she was going or what she would do. She only knew that she could no longer be a Preston. That identity was a cage, and the door had just been blown off its hinges. She needed to find Liam, not to beg for her old life back, but to understand the new one that had just begun, and to face the woman she had been, a stranger she no longer wanted to be. The days that followed the gala were a blur of systematic demolition. Liam, or Silas, as the financial world now exclusively called him, moved with the chilling precision of a master strategist dismantling a failed state. The board meeting on Monday was a formality, a public coronation. Richard and Marcus were unceremoniously voted out of their own company. The motion was proposed by Kenji Tanaka and seconded by a grim-faced woman representing the Swiss pension fund, an investor Richard had personally courted for years. There were no dissenting votes. The independent audit began immediately, and as Richard had feared, it was a bloodbath. Decades of creative accounting, of shell corporations used to hide personal expenses, of charitable donations that circled back to family-owned entities. It all came spilling out. The Preston Family Foundation was revealed to be little more than a sophisticated tax evasion scheme. The press, which had once fawned over the Prestons, turned on them with rabid ferocity. Headlines screamed of fraud, deception, and the epic downfall of a dynasty. The social consequences were just as brutal. Invitations were rescinded. Friends stopped returning calls. The Prestons were declared persona non grata at the clubs and restaurants they had once ruled. They were ghosts haunting the ruins of their own former glory. Eleanor retreated into the cavernous house, refusing to see anyone, a queen in exile in her own home. Marcus, stripped of his title and expense account, found his charm was no longer a valid currency. He was just another angry, unemployed man with expensive tastes and no income. Richard, facing potential criminal charges from the SEC, spent his days huddled with lawyers, his bluster replaced by a quiet, gnawing terror. Elara watched it all from a distance. She had left the estate the morning after the gala, checking into a simple, anonymous hotel in the city. She had her own money, a trust fund from her grandmother that was separate from the Preston Industries fortune. But she found she had no desire to spend it. The things she used to value, designer clothes, fine dining, the insulating comfort of luxury, now felt hollow, like artifacts from a dead civilization. She spent her days walking the city, anonymous in the crowds. She thought about Liam. She replayed their 5 years together in her mind, but this time she looked at it through a new lens. She saw his quiet patience not as weakness, but as extraordinary strength. She saw his simple lifestyle not as a lack of ambition. In retrospect, it was a profound act of integrity. He had wanted to build a life with her that was real, untainted by the distorting gravity of his wealth. He had given her the greatest possible gift, a chance to love him for who he was, and she had failed the test in the most spectacular way imaginable. The shame was a physical presence, a constant ache in her chest. But beneath it, something else was beginning to grow. Clarity. She was seeing the world, and herself, without the filter of Preston arrogance for the first time. The view was horrifying, but it was also true. After 2 weeks of self-imposed exile, she knew what she had to do. Begging for his forgiveness was pointless. She hadn't earned it. Demanding a share of his fortune was grotesque. There was only one thing left to do, to face him, not as his wife, not as a Preston, but as the person who had wronged him, and to offer the only thing she had left of any value, an honest accounting. Finding him was not difficult. The media was tracking his every move. He was operating out of a sleek, minimalist office in a building that overlooked Central Park. He had not taken an office in the Preston Tower. He was building something new. She took a taxi to the address, her heart pounding with every beat. She wore simple jeans and a sweater, no makeup, her hair pulled back. She was stripping herself of the armor she had worn her whole life. As she stood before the building, she nearly lost her nerve. What could she possibly say? What words could bridge the chasm of what she had done? Taking a deep breath, she walked into the lobby. She did not have an appointment. She had no status here. She was just a woman hoping to speak to the man whose life she had nearly destroyed, and who in turn had destroyed hers. She approached the desk, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm here to see Liam Hughes," she said to the receptionist. "My name is Alara Preston." The receptionist, a young, efficient woman, looked at her with an unreadable expression. For a moment, Alara was sure she would be told to leave, that he had left explicit instructions not to admit her. But the woman simply picked up her phone. "Mr. Hughes," she said, her voice low. "Alara Preston is in the lobby." There was a pause. The receptionist listened, then nodded. "Yes, sir. I'll send her up." She gestured toward the elevators. 35th floor. The elevator ride felt like an eternity. With every floor she ascended, the weight of her transgression grew heavier. When the doors opened, she stepped out into a quiet, sunlit space. It was the antithesis of the Preston Tower's dark, intimidating decor. The walls were white, the furniture was modern and light, and a massive window offered a breathtaking view of the park. Liam was standing by the window, his back to her. He didn't turn around. "Hello, Alara," he said. His voice was calm, neutral. It was the voice of a stranger. "Liam," she began, her own voice trembling. I needed to see you." He turned slowly. He looked tired, the immense weight of the past few weeks visible in the faint shadows under his eyes. But he also looked more himself, more real than she had ever seen him. "Why are you here?" he asked. It was not an accusation, but a genuine question. "If you're here for a settlement, my lawyer can handle that. I will be generous. You were my wife." The word "were" hit her with the force of a physical blow. "No," she said, shaking her head. "No, that's not why I'm here. I don't want your money." "Then why?" She took a ragged breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I'm here to apologize. Not to ask you to forgive me. I don't deserve that. But to say it, to look you in the eye and tell you that I am sorry. Sorry for my blindness, for my arrogance, for my cruelty. Sorry for being a coward. Sorry for failing you." Tears began to well in her eyes, but she would not let them fall. This was not about eliciting his pity. This was about giving him the truth. "I lived in a prison of my own making, Liam. A prison of status and appearances. And I judged you because you were free. I didn't understand your freedom, so I called it failure. That is my shame to carry, not yours." She looked around the beautiful, light-filled office. "This is who you are. I see that now. I was married to a giant, and I spent 5 years trying to cut him down to my size. It was a monstrous thing to do, and I am so, so sorry." Liam listened, his expression unreadable. He had imagined this conversation 1,000 times. In his fantasies, he had been angry, vindictive. He had wanted to see her grovel. But looking at the broken, humbled woman before him, he felt none of that. He just felt a profound, aching sadness for the life they could have had, if only she had seen him sooner. "I believe you," he said finally, his voice soft. "I believe your apology is sincere." A wave of relief washed over her, so intense she felt her knees weaken. "Thank you," she whispered. "But an apology doesn't erase the facts, Alara," he continued, and the softness in his voice was now edged with steel. "You didn't just fail me, you failed yourself. You outsourced your own judgment to your father and your brother. You let them define your husband. You let them define you. The question is not whether I forgive you. The question is, what are you going to do now? Who are you going to be now that the name Preston is no longer a shield, but a stain? It was the most important question anyone had ever asked her. It was the moral mirror he was forcing her to look into. He wasn't offering her a path back to him. He was challenging her to find a path back to herself. I don't know, she answered, her voice raw with honesty. I truly don't know. But I know I can't be the person I was. I have to build something new, something real, something of my own. He gave a single, slow nod. It was not an offer of reconciliation, but an acknowledgement, a sign of respect, the very thing she had denied him for so long. Then I wish you well in that endeavor, he said. It was a dismissal, a final closing of the chapter. Ilara nodded, accepting it. She had said what she came to say. She had faced the truth. There was nothing more to be done. She turned and walked back toward the elevators, her footsteps echoing in the quiet office. As she waited for the doors to open, she looked back one last time. Liam was still standing by the window, a solitary figure silhouetted against the vast expanse of the city, a king in his new kingdom. He was a world away. She pressed the button, and as the doors closed, she knew she was not just descending to the street below, but beginning the long, arduous journey back to ground level in her own life. 6 months later, the world had settled into a new alignment. Liam Hughes, now openly celebrated as the visionary Silas, had finished his corporate conquest. Preston Industries was rebranded as Athel Corp. Its focus shifted from the Preston's model of aggressive, predatory growth to Liam's vision of sustainable, foundational technology development. The rot at the core of the company had been excised. Richard Preston, facing an avalanche of evidence, had accepted a plea bargain that spared him prison time, but stripped him of the vast majority of his remaining fortune and banned him from serving on any corporate board for life. He and Eleanor lived in quiet, diminished seclusion in a much smaller house, the ghosts of their former selves. Marcus had fared worse. Unable to accept his new reality, he had attempted a series of ill-conceived schemes to reclaim his status, culminating in an insider trading attempt using residual information from his time at the company. He was caught, and his sentence was not as lenient as his father's. His arrogance had finally, definitively, cost him his freedom. Liam, for his part, did not revel in their downfall. He took no satisfaction from it. He had not acted out of revenge, but out of necessity. He had protected his life's work, and in the process had simply held up a mirror to the Prestons. The reflection had shattered them. His life was now busier than ever, but it was a life of purpose. He poured billions into his philanthropic ventures, the desalination plants in Asia, clean energy initiatives in Africa, and a new foundation genuinely dedicated to providing technological education in underserved communities. He was the man he had always been, just without the need for a disguise. He was still quiet, still thoughtful, but now his quiet was understood not as emptiness, but as depth. And Ilara? She had disappeared from the society pages, from the gossip columns, from the world that had once been her entire universe. She had finalized her divorce from Liam quietly and without contest. As he had promised, the settlement was generous, but she put almost all of it into a blind trust, taking only enough to live a simple, modest life. She sold her Maserati, her jewelry, her designer wardrobe. She moved into a small apartment in a quiet, unassuming neighborhood, worlds away from the Preston estate. She had taken his final question to heart. Who are you going to be? She found the answer not in a boardroom or at a gala, but in a small, underfunded community center in a struggling part of the city. She started by volunteering, helping to organize after-school programs. She discovered she had a talent for it, a knack for logistics, and for connecting with people when there were no pretenses involved. She was no longer Elara Preston, the socialite. She was just Elara, the woman who was good at organizing book drives and securing donations of second-hand sports equipment. One afternoon, while sorting through a pile of donated books, she came across an old, dog-eared copy of a classic novel. Inside the front cover was a handwritten inscription. To find true worth, one must first be willing to look past the cover. She smiled, a genuine, unforced smile. It felt like a message from the universe. Her work gave her a new sense of purpose, one that was real, intangible. It was not about appearances or status, it was about impact. She was building something of her own, just as she had told Liam she would. It was small, it was not glamorous, but it was hers. One day she was supervising the setup of several newly donated computers for the center's small tech lab. They weren't new, but they were functional, and the kids were thrilled. As she watched a young girl's face light up as she booted up a machine for the first time, Elara felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. A volunteer coordinator approached her, holding out a tablet. "Elara, look at this. The Ethel Education Foundation just announced a new round of grants. We might actually be able to get all new equipment." Elara looked at the screen. There was a picture of Liam standing with a group of students, a warm, gentle smile on his face. He was announcing a new billion-dollar initiative to fund community tech centers just like hers. His vision, his wealth, was reaching out and touching her new life, not as an act of pity or control, but as a force for good in the world. Their paths were still connected, not by a failed marriage, but by a shared, albeit newly discovered, purpose. She handed the tablet back. "We should apply," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I'll write the proposal myself." She knew they might not get it. She knew Liam might not even see the application. It didn't matter. She was no longer defined by his approval or disapproval. She was defined by her actions. She had learned the hardest lesson of all, that respect, dignity, and worth are not things other people can give you. They are things you must build, from the ground up, for yourself. And in the quiet, unassuming work of helping others, Elara Preston, the woman who once had everything and valued nothing, was finally building a life of true and lasting worth. So, what do we take away from this story? Perhaps it's a powerful reminder that a person's value can never be judged by their title, their bank account, or the car they drive. True worth lies in character, in integrity, and in the quiet strength to be who you are, even when the world wants you to be someone else. Arrogance may build empires of glass and steel, but they can be shattered in an instant. It is the foundations of humility and respect that truly endure. We have to ask you, have you ever been in a situation where you were completely underestimated? Or have you ever misjudged someone only to be proven profoundly wrong? Let us know your story in the comments below. We read every single one. Thank you for joining us on this journey today. If you found this story of vindication satisfying, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more content that explores the deepest corners of the human heart. Until next time, remember to look beyond the surface. You never know what treasures you might find.